Now on the GOP's immigration action as well, the commander-in-chief has used an executive order to ease the rules for immigrants trying to enter the United States. The aspect of the measure has roiled the GOP. He has eased the restrictions for those who have given limited support to terrorists or terror groups. This all was a result of a post-September 11th provision known as terrorism-related inadmissibility grounds. It affected anyone considered to have given support to terror groups. The term is considered to be far too broad for some. The Obama administration says it's been problematic. The change is one of the president's first actions on immigration since he pledged to take executive action during the State of the Union address last month. The GOP's response, as you can imagine, was swift.
The president right now, he needs to stop changing the law on, based on executive order. He needs to work with Congress.
There we have Senator Kelly Ayotte there. Congressman Bob Goodlatte of Virginia, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, said the president should be protecting U.S. citizens rather than taking a chance on those who are aiding and abetting terrorist activity. And plenty of Republicans are already using this as an example of what House Speaker John Boehner talked about last week, the fact that the GOP simply cannot the president. He's going to go around them. Also, some immigration advocates say Obama has been two-faced on this issue. Meanwhile, he has done more deportations than his predecessor, George W. Bush, but he's also publicly called to keep more immigrants in this country and accused the GOP of trying to tear families apart. Now, I'm joined now in the studio by former Congressman Allen West, Newsmax magazine senior editor David Patten. You know, when you hear the president talk about immigration reform and you see what he's doing there, at best it's confusing. Allen, you know, some people might say it's duplicity.
It is absolute duplicity. I think that when you understand the situation with national security, this is not the type of decision you should be making. And think about this. We're not even a year away from the Boston Marathon bombing.
Correct.
Where you had the Tsarnaev brothers, and, you know, they were going back into Chechnya, and they were meeting with these individuals, and now we're going to relax the standards. So I have to ask the question, what's the intent? I mean, what is really the purpose behind the president wanting to relax this standard at a time when, you know, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard General just last week made threats about terrorist cells being in the United States of America? We need to do things about, you know, student visas coming from a lot of these countries that are on terrorist lists. We should not be allowing people to come in this country. You know, what limited material support, how do you define that?
And David, despite the president's executive action, some Democrats were saying today, hey, you know, the president should be more upset about House Speaker putting the brakes on immigration reform. You know, is this just kind of the two sides exchanging fire in the early start of this debate here on immigration reform?
Well, it could be that some of it's political maneuvering. I think Allen West has some great points here about the general context that we're seeing for this. But, you know, one of the questions it raises is, do Democrats want a deal? Do they want to get a deal? Or do they want to have a campaign issue? And I would submit that if there was just one issue where you could come out with a stance, a position that would be sure to blow up immigration reform in whatever form it may take, this would be the one. This is the #1 issue for Republicans. We have to secure the border, they say,
right,
before we can do any kind of reform. When they come out and they say we're going to waive these rules, we're going to let people in, this is almost an invitation to the wrong type of people. And if nothing else, it sends a clear signal that probably they really don't want the deal. What they really want is the campaign issue.
Mm-hmm. And I have to agree wholeheartedly with David, because as you go back and you looked at the State of the Union address, the State of the Union address was not about things that can get this country back on track. It was about those small ball campaign issues. You know, you're going to talk about the minimum wage, the unemployment insurance extensions, the quote-unquote women's compensation, the income inequality, and now this immigration reform issue. But this is the wrong path to take, because this is a threat to the sovereignty, this is a threat to our national security, and no one wants to think that we're allowing more terrorists to come into our country right now. You know, I heard a great example of how this could work against, you know, what the president's doing. We just saw the movie Lone Survivor, and we remember they cut loose the three gentlemen that compromised the mission. And the one young man went right straight back down to the village and told the Taliban. Now, if he comes back and decides he wants to apply for citizenship here in the United States of America, and he can say, well, you know, I kind of spoke to the Taliban and gave them some information, is that limited material support?
Yeah, that's the question. You know, how do you define limited material support? So obviously there's some problems here, and it's easy to get upset about this one particular issue. But again, when we have to look at everything in the broader terms of immigration reform, Do you read into this, Alan, based on your experience? And we should say that Alan insists that we call him Alan, not Congressman or Lieutenant Colonel, because he's that kind of guy. It's hard for us. We're getting used to calling you Alan. But the House Speaker clearly is a little bit more confident about his position right now, that the GOP doesn't need immigration reform in any terms, any way, shape, or form in a comprehensive manner before the 2014 election. Does that also mean that he thinks that the GOP has a better chance of getting what they want after the election?
Well, absolutely. I think that if you look at, if you can win the Senate and you can maintain your majority in the House, you can do immigration reform the right way and not have a repeat of what happened in 1986. You know, our economy is not over the hump yet. I mean, we are not at 6.6 unemployment rate. We have to get Americans back to work. We have to take care of Americans. And so there are many people out there concerned about what happens with wages being depressed even further. What happens with unemployment getting even worse? I mean, in the black community, if you want to look at segmenting this, unemployment is close to 13%, black teenagers 40%. So now why do we want to open up the floodgates with more people? But the president has given, you know, John Boehner an incredible piece of high ground because the president is not trustworthy, as he stated. And so what does the president do? He goes out and unilaterally decides we're going to allow people with terrorist connections and affiliations to come into the United States of America as part of immigration reform.
Another thing people have talked about here, David, is that maybe this isn't the Speaker saying, I like my position. Maybe he's saying, hey, talk of the Heritage Action and those groups, the grassroots groups' demise may have been greatly overblown, and they're showing their teeth on this issue. Do you think it's that really forced the Speaker's hand on this?
Realistically, John, that's a big part of it. We heard the first tree that fell was actually Minority Leader Mitch McConnell coming out earlier in the week and saying that he considered immigration reform unachievable, irreconcilable were the words that he used. So he's looking at, in his own re-election effort, his own political right. So all of the senators who are Republicans particularly, and all the members of Congress, they have to guard that right flank. But I want to get back to this question of, if not now, when?
Right.
So if we're not going to do the immigration reform now, and I think it's highly unlikely that it'll happen before November, then the question becomes, when does it get taken up? And that's a real dilemma. That will still be a big dilemma for Republicans because basically the new Congress comes in 2015. You're already in the run-up to the 2016 presidential elections. Now, if we can't get immigration reform done now, how can we get it done in a presidential election year? And if you go into 2016 without some sort of resolution on immigration, how does it affect Republican prospects across the board, but particularly in national races? This is going to be a big question for the GOP.
Yeah. And that ties into the fact that, you know, we are go ahead and admitting that this has to get done before the election. Some folks in the GOP don't even think that it has to get done. That,
look,
you know,
I will tell you that this is the hot potato that's not going to get taken up in this midterm election cycle. This is a critical election cycle for the policy, the legislative future of this country. What the GOP has to do, and you and I had talked about this, they need to have a policy blueprint. They don't have a policy blueprint. They don't have a strategy. They don't have, you know, the contract with America that Newt Gingrich once had that everyone could see. This is where they are going.
And so
right
clearly
now.
You're not impressed with the framework the Speaker laid out.
No, I'm not impressed with the framework whatsoever because, you know, it would be just the same as I say, okay, guys, we're going to go into a battle. Well, you know, Commander, where's the plan? We're just going to go into the battle, and we'll kind of make it up as we go along. You need to have some type of strategy that people can rally to, that they can understand is based upon firm policy that really gets into everyone's, you know, living room and kitchen cabinet so that they can understand how you're going to help to improve their state in life right now.
All right, we'll have more on immigration reform. Dave's going to stick around with us, but before Alan goes, we do want to talk about the minimum wage increase and how this is going to affect unemployment. We heard the president's plan to enforce a new minimum wage despite large numbers of industry experts warning it will only serve to increase unemployment. After all, the number affected by the president's plan is barely 1% of the workforce. The Center for American Progress, John Podesta, now working in the White House, used to head the Center for American Progress and the Economic Policy Institute, whose donors include 20 labor unions and whose official stance is to raise the minimum wage, says it all makes a good economic sense. We have anecdotal stories. Raising the minimum wage is good for the economy. Raising the minimum wage is bad for the economy. Alan, what's your take, and how does the GOP need to counter the president's
This
plan?
is very simple. The unions want the minimum wage raised because guess what? They can start to get more dues because they're suffering right now. This is what has to happen. The employer needs to have the right type of policies, tax and regulatory policies, that enable them to pay their workers good wages. They need to be the ones that are raising the minimum wage, not a government, top-down driven thing. And you can look and see what's happened in California. California is always the petri dish, as well as Vermont for, testing, the progressive socialist policies. And it's going to fail, because what's going to happen is all of a sudden I come down to David and I tell him, you're going to have your minimum wage set at $12. Well, David's business might not be ready to subsume that type of cost.
David,
and on top of that, Obamacare costs. So someone's going to lose out. Either you're going to pass it to your customers, or you're going to cut back on your employment force. And that's just how it happens.
David, a recent poll from Gallup said that 76% of Americans favor raising the minimum wage. Basically, when you ask them a question, do you want to raise, they're going to say yes. So Republicans, they need a solid proposal to at least counter this argument that the Democrats are making. What is that proposal?
I think that proposal needs to be about educational opportunities for people who are trying to get ahead, as opposed to just coming in with a fiat and saying we're going to raise everybody's wages. One thing we got to keep in mind is we're in a time where every job is very sensitive to technology. And if you start raising the cost of labor, unlike prior decades when a lot of the studies have been done that show it's maybe a slight decrease in jobs, nothing too serious, try doing that today. You're going to see receptionists. You're going to see, there's even talk of some of the fast food establishments now automating their workforces.
All right, David, so, we'll get more from you on that. You're going to stick around, but we got to run right now to a commercial break. Alan, we'll have you back, I think, tomorrow, so we look forward to carrying on the conversation as well. We want to hear from you guys at home. If you could tweet me your questions directly at JohnB_Newsmax, also at Newsmax TV, and of course on Facebook as well, facebook.com/Newsmax. We'd love to get all your comments, and we'll have more coming up for you on America's Forum. When we return, we'll be joined by public relations expert Lanny Davis to discuss the Russian response to the PR nightmare that has become the Sochi Olympics. And the GOP facing another debt ceiling debacle, we'll have Davis's take on how they need to respond to this impending crisis situation. We'll be right back after this.